Maria has taught 4 classes for the Academy for Teachers. You're the record holder, Maria Tatar. That's how good you are. Her scholarship at Harvard has been wide ranging, and she's taught classes for us on fairy tales, on Alice in Wonderland, African American folklore, and then magic and fairy tales, which was also included Harry Potter. Her evaluations are always off the charts, but the reason I love Maria so much is not only that she's a great teacher and loves teaching and loves her students, but she really understands the importance of what you guys do. And she wants to support you. And she has been a great support and advisor to the Academy for Teachers throughout. So it's fantastic that Maria is #1 for our mini remote master classes because she is #1.
Terrific. Yes, here we are connecting, and I want to thank all of you first just for being there for your students, for continuing to teach, doing what you do so well, and then thank you for being here today, because what I want to do today is stage a great escape. That is, get out of the here and now. We always think of books, our favorite books, as escapist, as taking us somewhere else. But I always think of them as an escape into a wonderful flight, into elsewhere, to other places. And when we come back, we have what Neil Gaiman refers to as tools or equipment. That is, these symbolic stories help us navigate reality. They help us figure out who we are, what we're doing. They help us solve problems. And most importantly, they help us start talking to each other. They create contact zones. They make us think more, and they make us think harder. So here we go down the rabbit hole, through the looking glass, into Narnia or elsewhere, or what else, over the rainbow to the promised land. And we're going to do that by connecting. And I wonder if we can show the PowerPoint at this point. Is there a way that we can, yes, only connect. You can see that I borrowed the epigraph to E.M. Forster's novel, Howard's End. Only connect, which is what we're doing. And I wanted to start just with an experience from this past week when I had a conversation with a group of people from the Make Believe Foundation. And they wanted, just to try this experiment of reading a story and having people react to it. And what do they choose but the tortoise and the hare, a story that you all know, I'm sure. It's the one that ends with, slow and steady wins the race. And it was astonishing. We talked for a full hour, and we still had more to say. And what was amazing to me was that everybody had a different takeaway. That is, it's obviously about fast versus slow, but also about, as I've noted, nimble versus plodding, charismatic versus humble, old versus young. And I remembered reading the story, and I immediately thought that I had identified with the tortoise and embraced this idea of persistence. And the story is, I think here of, nevertheless, she persisted. But then after our discussion, I realized that I actually hated the tortoise as a child, that I loved the hare. He was young, he was energetic, and he got fooled in this terrible way and learned a lesson, and next time he would win the race. So these are, in a way, these fables. This is a fable from Aesop. This story reminds me a little bit of African dilemma tales, which are told in communities, and they don't end with happily ever after, but usually with a question, a big question. A question that has to do with, say, nature versus nurture, monstrosity and generosity, predator versus prey. So they take up all of these contradictions. They're simple stories, but they're simple stories that capture complex thought. And as I noted here, they're stories that get us talking, they help us process lived experience. And what I wanted to do in my presentation today, and I'll only take up 10 or 15 minutes, is just to run through the story of Little Red Riding Hood, a tale that is oriented toward the younger crowd, and then take a quick look at Snow White. And if we can have the next image here, I actually had this at the end of the presentation, but I thought that it might help us to just conceptualize some of the things that come up in the stories, because Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great French anthropologist, has this wonderful line, "Animals are good to think with." And of course, you know, start imagining Little Red Riding Hood and how much better the story is with the wolf in it. But Lévi-Strauss also tells us that these simple stories, these myths, fairy tales, cultural stories, legends, fables, are miniature models, and they help us think through cultural contradictions. And I love what Scott McCloud says in a very different context. He's talking about comic books. Simplification produces amplification. Things get larger than life and twice as unnatural in strange ways. So we start to work through these problems, the human-animal divide, the predator-prey, the question of, in Little Red Riding Hood, of seduction versus innocence. Okay, I'm such a rank amateur with Zoom, and I see that there's a question.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the PowerPoint. Am I the only one?
Oh, I'm not sure. Is anyone else not seeing it?
Okay, I'll figure it out, I guess.
There are options at the top there for you to have different views. Rachel, can you?
Oh, yeah.
I can just listen, it's okay.
Okay, we can always send you the PowerPoint. Let's go to the next image, and if anybody has any advice, you can just chime in. Here's a Chinese version of Little Red Riding Hood, and I love the fact that Ed Young gives us an epigraph to his retelling of that particular story. To all the wolves of the world for lending their good name as a tangible symbol for our darkness. So the symbolic power of these stories is something that I want you to keep in mind as we move to, you read the story of Grandmother, and I'm sure you very quickly noticed this is not a story for the young. This is a tale that was told by adults to multi-generational audiences around the fireside while people were carrying out chores and all of that. And it's a story that ends with Little Red Riding Hood rescuing herself. She's something of a trickster, and she uses her wits to get out of bed with the wolf. Now, if we go to the next image, we see that the story of Little Red Riding Hood enters print culture, and what happens immediately? It's reoriented toward children. It becomes an old wives' tale in a sense, stories that are told by grannies, nursemaids, servants, by women, kind of discredited almost as an old wives' tale. But what does Perrault do to rescue these tales for children? He attaches a moral. He puts an agenda in the story, and it's always so tempting to do that, especially when you're writing something for a younger audience. And what does Perrault do? He turns a story about a girl, a wolf, an encounter in the woods into a kind of morality tale about sexual predators. And let's see, I could just read this quickly. There are real wolves with hairy pelts and enormous teeth, but also wolves who seem perfectly charming, sweet-natured, and obliging, who pursue young girls and pay them the most flattering attentions. Unfortunately, these smooth-tongued, smooth-pelted wolves are the most dangerous beasts of all. Now, if we fast forward a century to the brothers Grimm in 1812, this is Perrault's writing in 1697, and our next image is going to show us the Grimm's version of the story. And here a moral isn't tacked on, but the Grimms actually do Perrault one better. Little Red Riding Hood, in the end, internalizes the lesson of the story. And in this case, it's really directed to the young. Never again will you stray from the path and go into the woods when your mother has forbidden it. And so the child inside the book and also outside the book has learned a lesson. And if we go to the next image, we can scroll through these fairly rapidly because they're modern versions of Little Red Riding Hood picture books that all, and today when we retell the story, we hold fast to that moral, I will never leave the path again when my mother tells me not to. And the next image, here's another, and this is a rather, you notice this Little Red Riding Hood looks like she's about 18, but she learns, never again will you stray from the path and go into the woods when your mother has forbidden it. And the next image, she promised never ever again to speak to another stranger, charming matters or not. This reminds me of an event from hell that I once participated in. It was take your children to work. And they asked me to give a talk about Little Red Riding Hood. It turned out the audience was sort of 6 months to 65 or so. And so I started though by asking the younger crowd what the story was about after I read a version of it. And in a chorus, they all chimed in, stranger danger. So they had learned that story or read that story in a new context. And the next image gives us another lesson, I think. If we can go, I think it's, here we go. Never again wander off in the forest. And the next one is, I will never wander off the forest path again as long as I live. I should have kept my promise to mother. So you can see that it's sort of now a sacred part of the story. It's written in granite, it's there, and it's very hard to dislodge it. So these stories from the culture, well, let's put it this way, the stories from the childhood of culture have sort of migrated into the culture of childhood. And in the process, they have kind of solidified into a print version, which is pretty much the same old story told over and over again. Yet at the same time, you know, we think this is a story that we discard when we grow up. And yet, if you look around in adult entertainment, you find that Little Red Riding Hood appears again and again. So let's take a look at the next few images, and you will find Tex Avery's Red Hot Riding Hood. Here the story is sort of packaged as entertainment for children, but it turns out that, you know, she's a singer in a nightclub, a singer and dancer in a nightclub, and it's really more entertainment for adults. And our next image gives us some of the films, The Company of Wolves, which was inspired by Angela Carter's rewrite of the story. And the next one, some of you may know Hard Candy, which gives us let's see, he's a sexual predator, an internet sexual predator. And there's the innocent Ellen Page, young and innocent, but you could see, there she is in the trap, but she will become the predator, the stalker in this film. And the next image gives us Hanna. She's a genetically modified teenager who's trained to be an assassin. And she grows up in the Norwegian woods. What does she read at night but Little Red Riding Hood? And then when she leaves the woods, she goes to Berlin to visit the house of Wilhelm Grimm. And if you look at her, of course, you see that she's not dressed as Little Red Riding Hood, but she looks very much like the wolf, and with her bow and arrow. And our next image gives us Little Red Riding Hood. I don't know why celebrities love to do, again, this, you know, play between innocence and seduction. So celebrities dressing up as innocents. And our next image gives us Angela Carter. So Little Red Riding Hood is a story that feminists took up in the 80s. We have Angela Carter's Company of Wolves, and it ends with this beautiful reconciliation between the wolf and Red Riding Hood. I love the Company of Wolves. At the same time, we've got Anne Sexton writing Transformations. in which she has a Little Red Riding Hood story, which begins, "Many are the deceivers." We have Margaret Atwood rewriting fairy tales, The Robber Bridegroom, Bluebeard's Egg, just a host of different stories. And our next image gives us, you can see Little Red Riding Crop. There's Little Red Riding Hood. It's strayed into the realm of soft porn and into advertisements. So you see on the bottom right, the wolf on a motorcycle racing off with Red Riding Hood in the back. And next image will show us a turn to another story. But you can see that this is a story that has a fascinating afterlife, not just in children's literature and in children's books, but in YA literature and in our entertainments for adults. So it's constantly remediated. And as I said before, we sort of think that it's not a story for adults, but in fact, it's constantly reappearing as some kind of entertainment for multi-generational audiences, but not just for the children. So we can talk about Red Riding Hood and maybe your experiences with the story, how it's possibly come up in your curriculum, in your classes, or whether it's a story that is just dismissed as something trivial, just a fairy tale, and nothing more than that. I thought we also could use this opportunity, and I think you read 4 different versions, or I sent out 4 different versions of Snow White. All of them are in my new book, which is called The Fairest of Them All, 21 Snow White stories from around the world. In the preface to that book, I didn't talk about what inspired me to find all of those different versions of Snow White. It was in part because I discovered that Snow White doesn't really have to have skin white as snow. And in fact, once you start going all over the world, you discover that skin white as snow is really the exception rather than the rule, that it was Disney who sort of fetishized this idea of skin white as snow. But what led me to write this book, and I think I take it back to not my own first experience with the film, but going to the movie with my daughter, who was then 5 years old, and discovering that she was totally fascinated by the evil queen, that it was the witch whom she found riveting. And she talked about the witch constantly and was fascinated by it. And I wanted to figure, why is that? What is at stake in the story? And if you think about this tale, what is it about? It's about mother-daughter rivalry, this totally toxic relationship, a jealous mother who wants to literally kill her daughter and who is jealous of her beauty. So it's a tale that is so complex because it gives us a beauty contest. Think back to the Trojan War. What started the Trojan War but a beauty contest? It's about a beauty contest, about this rivalry. It's also about sheltering in place with the 7 dwarfs, staying away from danger and evil. And it's also about death and resurrection, and generational change and renewal, and seasonal change and renewal. So it's such a rich, powerful story. And I think we shrink it down to something that is pretty flat when we focus just on the Grimm's version of the story, which is often seen as the canonical, authentic version, or the Disney version, which is the one that circulates so powerfully in our culture today. And just to get the conversation going about those stories, maybe we can have just the last couple of images. The next one will show you Maxfield Parrish's spectacular painting, Snow White. And if you have to look sort of carefully, it's hard to read this painting, but you see the vertical dwarf and then the horizontal Snow White in the glass coffin, lying in state. And do I have any more images there? I think, oh, well, yes. the effects of fairy tales. Some of you may know about Alan Turing's encounter with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He saw the Disney film, and he told his running partner, a fellow named Garner, that he used to chant while they were running the verse about letting the sleeping potion, let's see, I can't recapture it right now, but it's about letting the potion seep through the apple. And some of you may know that Turing committed suicide. And what did his landlady find by his bedside but a half-eaten apple? And in the kitchen, a jam jar with cyanide in it. So it's a rather chilling story, but file that under, you never know how these stories are going to connect with somebody's life. And this is one of those toxic effects, but I think I'm sort of on Bettelheim's team in this regard. Bruno Bettelheim, who wrote The Uses of Enchantment, and tells us that these stories help children process their feelings, help them process their feelings of anger, their emotional life, that seething cauldron of emotions that Freud talks about, and restore their faith in the possibility of a happily ever after. And one more slide, maybe, to end on a happier note. Oh, yes, let's end with Milan Kundera, who tells us, this is a painter in his novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, who refers to the surface of the painting. And I think you could say this about fairy tales as well. On the surface, an intelligible lie, a big old lie, as Zora Neale Hurston would say, something that you can't quite figure, well, you can figure out, an intelligible lie underneath the unintelligible truth. And the challenge with fairy tales is always to move from that simple surface, that intelligible lie, to all the complications of the unintelligible truths that keep changing and shifting. And I think you've probably noticed each time you read a fairy tale or any novel or imaginative work, you find that there's a different message that emerges from it.
I think we've got a couple of hands there. Brandon.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm thinking a little bit about some of the darker messages in some of the fairy tales. I'm reading right now Martha Nussbaum's new book. It's The Monarchy of Fear, where she's trying to think about fear as a driving force in our politics right now. And she talks about fairy tales at one point. And she's talking about how we can see animalism in people. We can sort of project disgust, and there's xenophobia, right? That comes up. And so she says that these stories often have these deformed figures, and that deformation, that kind of ugliness of the witch or the beast is sort of othering and could become a means of projecting the ugliness of the other. You see what I'm saying? Sure. And I'm wondering to what extent you think about that.
I would say it's exactly right. That is, these are stories that take up our deepest fears, our anxieties, our phobias. There's been a lot of recent writing on disability in fairy tales and how prominent it is. Anne Schmiesing has a wonderful book about that subject. So we often do have these encounters staged with the other who is repulsive and beastly and terrifying. And the question is what about a story like Beauty and the Beast? The reconciliation that takes place, the discovery that you can feel compassion for the other, that you can go through this process and discover that there's something connecting the two of you, and that there can be a kind of meeting of the minds in a way, not necessarily marriage. But I will say this, again, this is adult entertainment. Many of these stories are adult entertainment. So there are horrors in there and things that, I've never met a fairy tale that I didn't like. But on the other hand, I think that some fairy tales are just told in the wrong way and in ways that are disturbing, toxic, and disgusting in a way. But the beauty of the fairy tale is that we can rewrite it. We can make it our own. We can make it different, and we can make it speak to us. And, you know, if you look at some of the old tales, they're so politically incorrect. Well, why read that version? Why not read another version? Find another version that speaks to you, or make up your own version of the story.
Shataz.
Hi.
Yeah, Shataz?
Yeah, I'm here. So before I lose track, interestingly, Snow White was the first of the 3 stories that I heard, because when I was 4 and it came out in Bangladesh, that's just around when cable became available. So my parents would get VHS tapes, and the moral of Snow White about, you know, how the idealization of her skin color, like that's a remnant of like British colonialism in South Asia. So it's interesting how that seeped into our cultural mindset about how this is the feminine ideal of beauty and the raven hair, the pale skin. And but interestingly, when we read the readings that you sent us, there was one version of
Princess Aubergine.
Was that the one where it was the queen was jealous of the girl? Yeah, the princess, and then there was that whole polygamous element, and weirdly that was the one that made the most sense to me, because I grew up in a society where polygamy was acceptable, but the rest of it was very new to me. So it's interesting because of like globalization and just like cultural capital, like what kinds of stories resonated with me as a child growing up in Bangladesh, and how like Snow White made the most sense, strangely, especially the whole like fetishization of her skin tone.
Fascinating, yeah. And of course we have this, you know, the Disney version has become the corporate fairy tale, the one that everyone watches, and it's completely top down, not bottom up. I mean, these were stories that were told not just by peasants or by agricultural workers or laborers, but really by they were circulating in John Updike tells us they were the television and pornography of an earlier age. So these came sort of from the people rather than imposed on them from above. So part of my mission in writing the book on Snow White was to show that, you know, actually there are so many, you know, every culture has not just one version of Snow White, but multiple versions of it. So that's thank you for that comment about Princess Aubergine.
Steve.
Sure, yeah. Those readings were so much fun to read, and I was something that struck me was sort of the shift in roles that happened from some of the earlier texts to some of the more recent ones, specifically in the amount of agency that some of the female characters had. So I was just wondering if in your research, like you could comment a little bit on like what you've uncovered in these retellings as sort of like a social barometer or reflection of the values, or if you've seen trends sort of working as time's passed, as you know, from earlier stories to later stories that reflect the way societies have changed in their retellings.
Oh, great question. You know, it's fascinating to me. Somebody talked about teaching a course on social justice, and the past few weeks I've been looking at these stories like Bluebeard and Mr. Fox, which are these old stories from times past. Again, the old wives' tales, and they're fairy tales that we haven't really sort of kept in our culture. They're, you know, you can still find them in anthologies, but they're not the stories that are between the covers of children's books. And so Mr. Fox and Bluebeard and a whole host of other stories are about women who marry monsters or who are engaged to monsters, and how they discover sort of the history of their husband's crimes or their fiance's crimes. And what do? They invite everyone to a big dinner and then tell the story of the husband's past, the histories. and often produce evidence, like a finger from a corpse, or one of the previous wives, the finger is thrown across the room. So, this is like the early Me Too movement in a way. It prefigures that. These were stories, that told women, yes, there is a way out, but you're going to have to broadcast your story, and you're going to have to find some evidence. So yes, the stories keep changing, and clearly, women have more agency in them, because in the early versions, where's the happily ever after? If you have a beautiful dress, and if you know how to spin well, you will find your prince. So manual labor, good looks, a good wardrobe were what won you the prize. Clearly, we don't want to tell those stories any longer. So we have different ways of telling them. And yet at the same time, I think we can go back to those stories and find a certain degree of ancestral wisdom, a core there that is very powerful, that reminds us, we are all human, and we have changed, we have evolved, we hope in positive ways, but we're still facing those same cultural contradictions. Marriage, which can be, happily ever after, but it can also be deeply problematic. It can be domestic violence. It can have all sorts of terrible things going on in it. Yeah, thank you.
Tanya joined us, I guess, a little late and missed the introductions, and she has a question. Tanya, could you introduce yourself? Just tell what school, grades you teach, or subjects you teach, and some favorite book you teach before you ask your question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Tanya. I teach at the Manhattan International High School. I work with 10th and 11th grade students who are all English language learners, and I really enjoy teaching Macbeth with students with a focus on theater. And then I was excited to teach I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, but not going to get to do that. So hopefully next year. But I guess I was just thinking, I had a comment on how it's interesting. So the last version of Snow White, The Death of the Seven Dwarfs was really interesting to me, just because thinking about the Me Too movement and like everything that's going on now, that's kind of what I would think if I were watching Snow White now. So how she just kind of trusts to go to see the doors and live with them without, concern. And so like just how society has, I guess, shifted over the years in terms of mothers. I don't know. I wonder how like Snow White is viewed and shown, and like how it's talked about when young daughters are watching it. So.
Oh, a fascinating question about the way that she trusts the dwarfs. She's sort of in the house, so she has no choice in some ways.
Yeah.
But there are versions of the story in which she ends up in a house of robbers or thieves or just young men who are living together who all want to marry her. But in the end, they decide, since they can't all marry her, they're going to be older brothers to her. So they're benevolent and wonderful. And in some ways, it's a story about how her kindness converts the people living in the house, the robbers who are living in the house, and makes them kinder and gentler. But I'm not sure that I answered your question, or...
I mean, just in general, I was just wondering how like people perceive it in modern society, or like it's just interesting to think about.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Disney film, or I would say, it's not a film that my grandchildren have seen. I will say that it's not. They're all watching Moana or other things. So it's kind of great historical interest at this point. I mean, remember, this is a film that Eisenstein saw. He loved and hated it. And it's a film that Hitler used to watch. Goebbels thought it was a fantastic film. And he wished that he could recruit filmmakers to produce movies that would rival Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Almost unimaginable. But, to me, it's of great historical interest. It's not something that we want to get. I mean, just the voice of Snow White is painful to listen to. That sort of sweet, sappy voice. And there is so much to give offense because she's a good housekeeper, and that beautifully executed housekeeping scene sort of says women are there to clean up and housework is fun and you're going to have these little animals helping you and so on and so forth. You can probably think of other moments in that film that you hate. So, yeah.
Amber.
You actually got to my question a little bit. I just looked up when Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs came out, and it was in 1937. And I remember we actually had the VHS tape in my house. My grandma had bought it. And I remember watching it as a non-white person, being very struck by what you said before, like the fetishizing of like her white skin. And so it was funny because my grandma would tell us about how she saw it. Like that was like one of the first movies that she went to go see in the movie theater because she was around 4 years old. But my mother was like, oh, this movie is like extremely fetishizing of white skin. And like, we had to like talk about it afterwards. But I was just wondering if you could go a little bit more into like the historical context as to why, because you had said earlier, Disney was very much like hyping up
the skin whiteness.
And you already mentioned a little bit, but I just would love to hear more about that in the production and like what the behind the scenes discussions were like.
It's fascinating to me that fairy tale colors are red, white, and black. If you look at the tales, you see those are the colors that come up again and again. So that, Snow White, lips red as blood. Actually, in Grimm, it's white as snow, cheeks red as blood, I think, and then hair black as ebony. So you have those three primal colors, and we could talk a lot about that, just the color coding in fairy tales and, in literature in general. But then when Disney saw a film version of Snow White when he was young, and I think that's sort of what inspired him to do the Snow White film. And originally he thought about it as, kind of a comedy, that the witch would be a sort of slapstick figure. And over time, the witch became more and more evil and demonic. And he talked about her as a Jekyll Hyde figure. But in fact, she's pure, which is the evil one, Hyde? Hyde. She's pure Hyde. She's not Dr. Jekyll at all. So you get this demonization of the wicked queen. Also, she's a charismatic figure, but at the same time, maternity and evil are connected very powerfully. So it's problematic in that sense too. But then, as I said, eventually they added that skin white as snow, and the whole visual appearance of Snow White, like Cinderella and like all of those Disney. Have you ever gone on the Disney Princess website?
Unfortunately, I have.
You can go there and they're all lined up in all their diversity. And then you realize that they look exactly alike and they're all exactly the same body type. And they all speak in these very high-pitched voices that are deeply annoying. So Disney has changed and evolved. And, I think you can all find Doc McStuff. I think they do Doc McStuffins, which is a wonderful series. I kind of credit with Disney with keeping fairy tales alive, but there's a lot in the history that is deeply problematic that we have to analyze. And I think, one of the great things about the Disney films is that first of all, your students will all know them, or probably many of the students will know them and compare them with the earlier versions. And those comparisons always produce a lot of interesting friction and discussion.
Sarah.
Yeah, actually, I guess I can sort of add on to, I sort of wanted to add on to what Amber was just saying and then say something else. I work exclusively with students that, almost exclusively with students that are immigrants themselves or their parents are immigrants. And all of them are non-white, and the vast majority of them have seen the Disney movie of Snow White, have seen Cinderella, have seen actually all of those old movies. And they've been sort of held up as this like American standard. But they never notice the whole like they use the word fair to describe skin over and over and over again, and they don't seem to notice that like the girls who are fair of skin or white as snow, like those are the ones that get rewarded, and people that have some sort of like, you've either got the dwarves or you have the woman who's dressing up by coloring her face, like making her face darker, like she's the one that gets punished in the end. There's like a lot of that dynamic just in the old stories that actually is really interesting, and they don't necessarily notice it unless you're kind of pointing it out to them. And another kind of thing that never gets noticed is that like the charming princes, the heroes, there's something so unfathomably creepy about every single one of them. And the Snow White one in particular, and my students go nuts over this. She's like a 7-year-old girl and she's dead in a coffin, and the prince is like, I gotta have that. And my students are like, is he a pedophile? Is he a necrophiliac? And I'm just like, yeah, maybe both of those things. So, I mean, there's a lot going on that students wouldn't pay attention to otherwise, but is really important to draw their attention to.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for mentioning fair, because of course, fair has a double meaning, which is why I called my book The Fairest of Them All. And, you know, the whole question of the connection between beauty and justice, the symmetry of beauty. Elaine Scarry has a wonderful book called Beauty and Being Just. That's Elaine Scarry, Scarry. And is there a way that we can make a move from beauty to fairness and social justice? We're getting back to that idea of reconciliation, where for Angela Carter, the happily ever after is somehow the meeting ground, producing a meeting ground for understanding each other, no longer afraid, but courageous and embracing the other. I mean, fear is our biggest enemy, as you know, I don't need to even say that, but somehow getting past that fear of monstrosity, that fear of the other, and discovering that there is common ground, and that you can have fairness and justice.
Wayne.
Hi, it's a fascinating conversation. I had two questions, or two thoughts actually. The first one was when you were talking about the tortoise and the hare, and how you switched the animal that you identified with over time, that you went from one to the other. The animal that I've always identified with in that story is the fox. And I've always wondered, why a fox? So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. The other thing that I was interested in is when we look at the story of Snow White, we all look at it with our own personal bias. And so it's, you know, I look at it through the lens of a Black male, or someone else as a female, or of race or country of origin. And I think when we look at the story of Snow White, we're looking at mostly the Disney version. That's the most, you know, widely distributed version. But what is the language of the other versions? That's the other thing that I'm curious about.
Yes, okay, several questions. First, the tortoise and the hare. Is the fox the judge in a version that you heard?
Yes.
Oh gosh, I don't know. You know, isn't it wonderful that it actually exists in so many different versions? We have the canonical Aesop version, which of course is not always told with Aesop's words, but rewritten. And remember, Aesop was probably a slave from Ethiopia, from present-day Ethiopia. So, you know, the whole question of origins. He happened to be the first one to write it down. There were probably many different versions circulating in the culture, just as there are today. So you have to tell me more about the fox judge, but I love the fact, you know, foxes are sly. So, you know, I love the introduction of a trickster figure who is going to judge this race and do some. So get back to that in a second. But let me see the languages of the Snow White stories. I tried to go all over the world. And the astonishing thing to me was that there was no shortage of Snow White stories. They were everywhere. And you know, the one deeply problematic matter is that if you go to China and try to find a Snow White story, you can find one, but it's probably collected by either an anthropologist or a missionary. Same is true for African countries. Or so, you know, for better or for worse, I wanted to include those stories because they were the earliest recorded versions. And yes, you can go for authenticity, but I'm not an anthropologist and I can't do field work. So I had to sort of settle for those stories. But tell us more about the fox.
Well, so my thinking is with the fox is that, you know, you have these two rivals with these two completely different methods of accomplishing the same task. They both want to travel a certain distance and they want to be the superior animal when they do that. But in my thinking, the fox is has sort of like taken a step back and is just the observer of all the action that's going on. There's also, I mean, like the versions that I know, or the ones that come to my mind are the celebration at the end of the race, because all of the other animals have been beaten by the rabbit every day. So they're all really rooting for the underdog.
For the underdog, yeah. That's perfect, because I think one of the reasons we love fairy tales is that they are about the underdog, the victim who turns the tables on the rival, using wits or whatever strategy. You know, how do you, you know, not just how do you survive? I mean, these are sort of primal issues. How do you manage to find the happily ever after, which may just be a good meal or something banal like that, but how do you get to that next meal? So
that is a very appropriate question for today. How do we survive? We have come to the end of an hour. Thank you all for joining us. I hate to just sort of like click those little buttons and have you all disappear, but
back to reality.
Thank you.
Yeah,
that's what we need to do. Thank you all. Keep up the fight. Be good.
Well,
okay.
Sandy team. This
So
was
you're
an
going to be
amazing
Bye.
thing on a Friday night. I loved it. Absolutely perfect.